and to the new witnesses that are with us as well. Can I first of all start with Mr. Flynn? You work for Internal Audit.
That's correct. I'm the National Director of Internal Audit for the HSE. Okay.
And can I first of all say well done on what is a good job
Thank you.
For the information that has been provided to us. As the Director General has said, it's quite limited. You can't audit every organisation, but you have provided the CNAG's office and also, as a consequence of that, us with valuable information. What does Internal Audit check for when it examines the accounts or the practices or governance or whatever of these organisations? Specifically, what do you look for?
I think what we do, first of all, Deputy, is one of the audits that we do, we look at the HSE's management of the grant process, how their own procedures operate, and then we go and visit a number of these organisations. And we'd be looking at everything really from a financial perspective. We'd be looking at the governance, we'd be looking at board minutes, payroll, travel expenses, procurement, basically all the financial controls one would expect to see in an organisation.
Would it be fair to say, in broad terms, you would look at compliance issues?
We would broadly look at compliance issues, yes.
Okay. So issues in relation to systems, practices, procedures, policy would be a matter for the executive and a matter for others. It wouldn't necessarily be a matter for yourselves.
I think, I think in regard to financial kind of procedures, as regards to the services they provide, we wouldn't have the capability to assess that. Yeah. We are financial accountants and auditors.
Absolutely. So, and this is maybe for Mr. O'Brien then, there would be a separation of roles in relation to internal audit, the compliance unit, and then the HSE executive. Yes. So internal audit would, as has been said, examine compliance, but it wouldn't enforce compliance. That's not its job. Its job is to report. So whose job is it then to enforce compliance?
If, for example, internal audit are auditing an organisation that's funded by a CHO or a national division, then the management responsibility for pursuing the findings of an internal audit lies with the person who holds the funding or is our party to the service agreement.
Okay, so it would be the compliance unit?
Well, the compliance unit has a function different to, but not dissimilar in principle to the internal audit function. So the compliance unit is seeking to assist agencies improve their compliance through a number of standardised processes and support functions. The business relationship is between whoever within the HSE has commissioned.
Where would the buck stop then in terms of enforcement?
It stops with the funder within the HSE.
Which would be the organisation that receives the funding?
No. If for example, we're dealing with an organisation that's funded nationally, just to keep it simple.
Are you talking about the difference between CHOs and
there are some
structures in the HSE you're talking about?
Yeah, there are a mix of organisations in the 2279. Some are funded at a local level, some are funded at a national level. So we can take either, but just for the sake of simplicity, I'll take a national example. A national service provider, say in mental health, is commissioned by the Mental Health Division. The audit would be carried out by internal audit function, and internally that would be received by the relevant national director in the HSE, who would be responsible for progressing the actions that arise from the audit.
But it would be elements or units of the HSE would be responsible for enforcement.
Oh yes.
And ultimately the buck would stop with you as the accounting officer accounting back to the PAC.
Exactly.
Not micromanaging everything, but in overall terms, the buck would stop with you.
Yeah, the internal audit division and the compliance unit are not part of the management process. No.
Can I turn to, and maybe we can get it up on the screen, the CNAG's report, that section of the report which deals with the management and oversight of grants to health agencies. Page 275 first, it's the one just prior to that. As you can see, it talks about what it calls internal audit commenced a programme of random audits of agencies in receipt of funding below 1 million. Is that correct, Mr. Flynn? And then it goes on to say that a summary of the type of issues identified by the HSE internal audit from their reports published in 2016 is shown in figure 1911, which is the following page. Is that based on that random audit?
It's based on all audits that we would have conducted, all internal audits.
Is it based on random audits?
Some would be random, some would be targeted.
So it's difficult for us then to know whether they were random or audited. So how many audits then?
It's an amalgam of all of them.
Okay, how many audits then was there in terms of that would have informed figure 1911 and a summary.
There would have been approximately 19 audits that would comprise that
19, and we have a copy of the breakdown of those 19.
That's supplied, yeah.
If we can get that up on the screen as well. So we got a breakdown. So this is then a combination of both random and maybe what you might describe as targeted auditing.
Yeah.
How many were done randomly and how many were?
I would think in 2016 most of them would have been targeted audits. In 2017 we will be doing a lot more random audits as well. We've set up that programme as has been mentioned in the CNAG's report. So in 2017 we would hope to do in the region of 40 audits, and a lot more of those would be random then as well as targeted.
But if we take literally what the CNAG's report says, it says random, it doesn't say random and targeted. Why was that, Mr. McCarthy? McCarthy, I'm sorry, I'm asking Mr. McCarthy that.
Sorry.
If we go back to 275, and we're talking specifically here, Mr. McCarthy, about the summary of the HSE internal audit findings 2016. It talks about, it doesn't even name how many, so it's 19 as we know because we got the follow-up, but the relevant paragraph says that this was on the basis of random audit of agencies, but in fact it wasn't just random, it was targeted as well.
No, I think what we were talking about is ones that were completed in 2016, so their origination would have been earlier than that, and some of the accounting periods that they are referring to would have been earlier.
Would you accept, though, it's not clear, it maybe not as clear when you're reading it?
No, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I think my interpretation of that would be that as and from 2016, the selection process into the future will have an element of random.
That. And then, so of the 19 then that are a combination of random and targeted, again, sorry, how many were random?
Most of that table would be targeted, but some
Why were they targeted?
Well, as part of our normal audit process, we would ask line divisions if they have particular issues around certain funded organisations, and we would attempt to include those in the plan. For example, you will see in that console, and obviously that was one where line management specifically requested us to conduct an internal audit because they had concerns about that particular one, so we would have conducted
And in your professional opinion, Mr. Flynn, as an internal auditor, first of all, you would have had sight, I'm sure, or did you do any work, or had you any oversight over the internal audit into Console?
Yes, it was done by my division.
Your division?
Yes.
And you will remember that I think there was over 60 findings, wasn't there?
That's correct.
And they were all classed as having systemic difficulties, if you like, and there was an overall quote where it said that they, in fact, in their entirety, they had national implications for the HSE.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. Would you describe then those findings as failures?
They would be failures within the organisation, yes, certainly. And
which organisations?
Within the funded agency, certainly.
Okay.
And the learning from that then is applied to the HSE to
but would there be any failures in terms of oversight and enforcement?
Well, I think it does point to a need for greater enforcement and greater
if you
effort by
have
the HSE.
an internal audit report, and we'll just stick with this one organisation first before I get to the others, which says that there are 60 findings here, all very serious, all show systemic problems, all were rated the highest priority, if you remember, all of them, every one of them, and it says this has significant national implications for the HSE. So if the internal audit report says significant national implications, that's the exact wording, that would point then to there were systemic failures in terms of compliance, I would imagine, and enforcement of compliance. Would that be fair or reasonable?
I think it is. I mean, what we're saying, I think, is potentially systemic rather than systemic. But, you know, we would say that I mean, the Console audit would be an example of an audit where virtually it's the poster boy for everything that can go wrong in a funded organisation.
Do you accept then that in terms of process from the HSE side, in terms of enforcement, given the gravity of the issues in this organisation, and we have 90 more, and we'll go through all of those in a second, it does point to failures in oversight and enforcement of compliance. All I'm asking is, would that be a fair assessment?
I think it is, but I think also, as the Controller and Auditor General's report makes out, there have been improvements, and there are improvements. And
we'll get to the improvements, but we're talking about reports
there
which are in front of us.
There would be, as I say, in that report, particularly a lot of...
You see, improvements are something that will happen in the future.
Yeah, well, I think it's already started.
Sorry, Mr. Flynn. What you do is a look back, isn't that right?
That's correct.
The CNHE does a look back as well. It's what the purpose of an audit is, to do a look back. And when you do a look back, you don't look to the future as to what can be improved. You can make recommendations, but that's a matter for the executive.
Exactly.
And it's a matter for those in policy. What you examine are failures. And all I'm asking is, can you at least acknowledge, can internal auditors acknowledge that there was, notwithstanding the failures in the organisations, which is obvious given the gravity of the issues, that there was also failings in terms of compliance and enforcement?
That's a fair comment.
That's a fair comment. And when you were here, Mr. O'Brien, as a witness when we discussed the Console issue and the internal audit report, one of the exchanges over and back between you and I was that whole issue of the role that the HSE played and whether or not there was any failings. And what you said is, and I have the copy of the transcript here, what you said is, with respect, Deputy, and I was putting the question to you, was there any failings on the HSE side? And you were saying no. You said, it is a different thing. We are talking about learnings. As the Chairman asked us earlier about learnings. Learnings are not necessarily the result of failings. They are learnings. So we've heard now from internal audit. Do you accept, given what's before us now, and I will get into the details of that now in one moment, but in terms of the snapshot that we have in front of us of the 19 different funded organisations, where it does show, not in all cases, so some of them got a clean bill of health, but very few, but in the vast majority of them where issues have been identified. Do you still hold the view that there was no failings on the HSE side in terms of compliance or enforcement, or would you now have maybe a different view?
Well, you're now asking me my view on an answer I gave in a specific case at a general level. The answer I gave in the specific case I stand by, and I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that we're talking about what was a rogue agency, that the issues that were surfaced by the internal audit report were related to the use by that body of funds that were not provided to it by the HSE, and in respect of which there were over successive years a clean audit certificate which entirely misrepresented the position. Now, clearly that has changed our view to some extent of how much reliance we can place on audit certificates, though we have no option but to place a good degree of reliance on them.
Sorry, Mr. O'Brien, the point that I made to Mr. Flynn in the context I gave was the Console report. Yes. Because it was so profound in terms of every one of the findings had a high priority. It talked about all of them in their totality having national implications for the HSE. He was very clear that that did point to problems or failings in relation to compliance and enforcement. So the internal auditors are entitled to have a different opinion from the Director General, and they've given that. So whether it's to do with Console or whether it's to do with all of them in their totality. Sorry, Mr. O'Brien.
But if I can, you're asking me whether my opinion in relation to Console is also my opinion in relation more generally.
You can ask both, answer both.
I'll be happy to answer. My opinion in relation to Console is that the audit report clearly pointed to systemic issues, and one of the consequences of that is that Console is no longer here and HSE no longer funds it, but had to be clear about ensuring there was a replacement service before defunding. But it remains the case that what the internal auditors found was the misuse, the flagrant misuse of charitably given funds, not HSE funds, but which went right to the heart of the honesty of our relationship with that organisation, which meant we could no longer have such a relationship. And that does have generalisable lessons, to use the phrase I used there, which does affect the way both internal audit, management and the compliance unit relate to those types of organisations. In relation to other issues, what happens is, on a quarterly basis, the National Director for Internal Audit presents at the national leadership team of the HSE a report covering all of the audits concluded in that period, with a summary of all the findings, graded by classification. We discuss them, we discuss the generalisability of them, and then we have a process as part of that report of tracking the extent to which, in relation to all previous audits, recommendations have or have not been closed out. So these audits are taken seriously. They are used as a way of changing the way we do our business as an organisation.
Interject and say that I'm not for 1 second saying that you have not taken any of this serious, or that the HSE as an organisation has not addressed these issues in a serious way. What I'm simply trying to establish is, in the first instance, does the HSE at a corporate level accept that there potentially was failings in terms of compliance and enforcement? I'm not entirely satisfied with your response, but I'm entitled to have... Sorry, if I can just finish first, Mr. O'Brien. I'm entitled to draw a conclusion and you're entitled to give your view. The second question then is...
But are you asking me specifically about Console?
No.
Okay.
No. And the second issue then is in relation to learnings, because I think that is important, and you learn from mistakes, in my view. So whether it's the mistakes of the organisations that are funded or the HSE, you learn from mistakes. And the third element of it is, well, in terms of lessons that were learned, what changes were made in practices, policies and procedures. And that's what I want to try and establish if I can. So if I can come to that table that's on the screen, Caherlock. So this is the 19 audited reports that frame the basis of the previous table, which generalised the areas of concern. And the types of issues of concern that have been identified by internal audit are a high number of bank accounts, incomplete accounting records, transactions not authorised at appropriate levels, expenditure on gifts and entertainment, poor audit trails over credit card expenditure, absence of policies and procedures regarding conflicts of interest of board members and confidential disclosures, board members not completing SIPO returns, salary payments in excess of deeper pay scales, senior staff in receipt of allowances and round sum payments, staff in receipt of bonus payments, procurement issues including contracts awarded without competitive procurement process, and documentary evidence not retained for the awarding of contracts. So when I look at all of that, it almost jumps out at me that this is very similar to Templemore in many ways in terms of the type of issues. High numbers of bank accounts, incomplete accounting records, transactions not authorised, expenditure on gifts and entertainment, all of them. So it strikes me that this is something that obviously should concern us. And then we look at the 19 different organisations. And I'm looking at Console, if you go down to line item number 8, Mr. O'Brien. So for 8 then, I think for Console, in terms of the different, because what you do is you break down the areas of concern into 5 broad areas, and there are sub-headings within them. So for Console, it's 1B, 1C, 2A, 2B, almost all of them, that they fall foul of the areas of concern. I think that would be fair to say. But they're not the only ones. So I'm trying then, some of these haven't hit our radar at all, and I'm trying now to understand or establish what is the issues within these organisations and what corrective action has been taken. The one above that, the Catholic Institute for Deaf People, if we can see that one. The concerns for that organisation are high number of bank accounts, incomplete accounting records, absence of financial procedures and controls, expenditure on gifts and entertainment, poor audit trails over credit card expenditure, salary payments in excess of approved pay scales, senior staff in receipt of allowances and lump sum payments, staff in receipt of bonus payments, and also contracts awarded without competitive procurement. That's just one example I can pick. What is this organisation, and how many people are employed by it, and what level of funding does it get from the HSE?
I can answer the question on the funding. It's approximately...
Well, okay.
Sorry,
you can answer. Yes.
3.7 million a year.
3.7 million? 3.7 million of taxpayers' money?
Yes.
This is the Catholic Institute for Deaf People. And yet there's all of these issues, areas of concern. So what has been done about that, Mr. O'Brien?
In relation to each organisation against which there are adverse audit findings, these will be reflected both in the oversight arrangements thereafter, amendments to the service arrangements. There will be tracking of implementation of audit recommendations, and they are subject to further audit. And clearly, if there is not a response to the internal audit findings, the question of ongoing funding becomes at issue. But just to say, you draw a comparison with another place earlier. These organisations are not part of the HSE. They're organisations that we fund. We don't control them. They're voluntary bodies, and I spoke in my opening statement about the nature of the relationship. I believe the analogy...
So, I'm under no illusions whatsoever that these organisations are not state agencies.
Yeah, but you were drawing an analogy with another organisation that's part and parcel of a state agency. And I just wanted to be clear.
Okay, I understand completely that these organisations are private organisations. Some are community-based that receive HSE funding, and only a portion of their spend may be state funding. So, but we understand that that's the nature of Section 38 and 39 organisations. We do understand that. What I'm saying is I'm looking at the failures here in terms of this particular organisation initially, and it shows that these are, again, systemic. They raise very serious concerns across all of the areas. So what I'm asking is, what corrective action was taken? What sanction was imposed, if any, on the organisation following this audit?
The relevant service managers will have pursued the implementation of audit recommendations. This organisation will be under...
What does that mean?
Each individual audit report contains a set of recommendations designed to address the findings. They will be classified as to severity. There will then be a process of agreeing a period of time within which they need to be rectified, which will vary depending on the nature of the rectification, the practicality of rectification, and that will then form part of the oversight process.
And I still, from that response, am none the wiser as to what sanction was imposed, if any, on the organisation. I hear a lot of that tells me there's lots of bureaucracy, there's lots of paperwork, there's lots of exchanges of maybe papers and emails, but I'm not hearing any sanction.
The process is not one designed for sanction. It is one designed to improve the governance processes. Let's just look at...
I'll come back to that. No, hold that for a second, because
I'm trying to
answer
2 minutes. Your question.
You've answered it. So you've said that it's not one of sanction, which is what I've asked. So you've answered that question. I want to move on to...
Yeah, but you've interrupted me mid-sentence. The process is not one designed for sanction. But as we've seen in the case of Console, where the issues are serious enough, the extinguishing of the organisation can be a consequence. And if that's not a sanction, I don't know what is. And
I am... Well, we'll get to that in a second, Mr. O'Brien, but I'm looking now at St Hilda's Services Limited at Loan. Again, the second one I've just highlighted. So again, in this organisation, high number of bank accounts, incomplete accounting records, absence of financial controls, expenditure on gifts and entertainment, poor audit trails of a credit card expenditure, non-rotation of board members, salary payments in excess of approved pay scales, contracts awarded without competitive procurement, lack of policies and procedures in relation to procurement. Again, here's another organisation where there is failures. What I want to try and establish, Mr. O'Brien, if I can, is how can I, as a public Accounts Committee member, be satisfied that taxpayers' money is being spent for the purposes in which it is given, and the organisations that avail of taxpayers' money have appropriate procedures and policies in place to ensure the protection of taxpayers' money. When I have in front of me an audit of 19 organisations, of which is out of a number of 2,200, I think is the total amount, 2,000, and that's a total spend of how much?
3.7 billion.
3.7 billion. So I'm sure, Cathaoirleach, that the witness will understand of a spend of 3.7 billion and thousands of organisations that avail of this funding, and we have only a sample in front of us, and I've given 2 examples where there's major problems. I'm sure the witness will understand that I would have an anxiety on behalf of the people that I represent that there is a difficulty here in terms of governance and compliance and enforcement. And with respect to what I'm hearing from you, Mr. O'Brien, is that, and maybe just because I'm up on time, you might, because I don't want to be unfair, you might give us your view now on what improvements have been made. But I have read your opening statement, and I've read some other documentation from yourself as well. It seems to suggest that your response is more communication in terms of more forms, more form filling. But it seems to be very short on actual sanction, and that concerns me. So maybe if you could respond to that.
And then we move on to Deputy Connolly after this answer.
First of all, if the Deputy or the Committee would like a detailed explanation as to the specific actions that have arisen in relation to each of these, we've no difficulty providing that, but we weren't asked for that in advance. What I would say is I think that the committee should actually take comfort from the fact that we have both a well-developed internal audit function and a compliance function which are addressing these issues. And the very reason that we're able to tell you about these deficits and the very reason that they're being addressed and improved is precisely because we have a proactive programme of audit.
Can I just put one final question, if I can? Just one final question. You see, what I see is more paperwork, Mr. O'Brien, and I would argue that what we need is more powers in relation to compliance. I would argue, Mr. O'Brien, that what we need and what maybe your organisation needs is more powers in relation to compliance. So have you asked for more powers? Have you examined more powers to ensure there is greater enforcement and compliance and sanctions? Do you need more powers? It's something the Oireachtas can help you with. Because I don't think more paperwork with respect is a reasonable response from you today, which is all I hear. If you need more powers and if compliance needs to be strengthened, tell us. Because that's our job. Our job is to look at robustly at policies, procedures and practices. Tell us if you need the powers.
Sure. I think the only person who's used the expression paperwork with respect is your good self. The processes I've talked about are much more significant than emails and letters. They're direct dialogue, they're meetings with boards. When we look at this set of organisations here, most of them relatively small organisations, true voluntary bodies, ordinary, well-meaning, not always well-equipped individuals trying to do their very best for cohorts of people. And they're doing that against a context where the regulatory burden that we're imposing on others can be quite complex to do. So we start from a point of assisting them to improve. That is what the primary purpose of internal audit is. But where we find barn door problems, we take much more dramatic action. Now, as the HSE, we could do one of two things in relation to these things. We can identify problems and have a process which is about eliminating those problems, getting that organisation into a better state while protecting the services it provides. Or we could take the cover your arse approach, which frankly I don't take, and say, right, we will simply stop the funding because at some point I'll have a difficult conversation like this at the PAC and the people who are the beneficiaries of the service suffer as a result of it. What we try to do is work with service providers to assist them to improve their compliance. That's why I say it starts from that place. If, however, we are not getting a suitable response, if what we find is, absolutely unacceptable, then we go a different route, but also seeking to protect the service providers.
I'm not comforted by the two examples I gave.
Fine.
That the appropriate corrective sanctions were made by your organisation. Okay. And I only gave two examples.
What I've undertaken to do, if the Chairman would like, is give you a written response which outlines the sanctions. I think we were asked for this table 2 days ago.
And it's a great table to get. Yeah. I think we appreciate and we accept that. It's a great summary.
I'm glad you asked for it, but you asked for it 2 days ago.
Yeah.
And consequently, what we don't have is all of the documentation that you might have otherwise wanted once you'd had a chance to read that.
Okay.